Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 50 Movies number 1. So, I began this series of videos about 10 months ago where I would count down my top 50 favorite movies of my lifetime. So basically my favorite movies from the 80s, 90s, 2000s to present. I started off with a video where I quickly went through my number 50 through 21 and then did two videos where I went through my number 20 through 11 in a little more detail, and then I did a singular video for each movie in my top 10 so I could give more of a detailed review on each film in my top 10 and explain exactly why I loved it so much. Those of you that have seen some or all of these videos will know that I don't choose movies that are typical of those that appear in the typical internet top 10 list. Most of them would have in their top 5 some sort of variation of The Godfather, Star Wars, Citizen Kane, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Gone with the Wind. None of those you'll find on my top 50. And if you want to see a typical top 10 movie list more like that, just go out on the internet and no longer than 10 minutes you'll find dozens of carbon copy lists that all look exactly alike. So if that's your thing, you have dozens of other options, but that's not what my list is for. My list is to name my personal favorite movies that have inspired me and reinforced my love of films and great storytelling, and I give not one flying fuck on what anyone else thinks of these films, how many stars pretentious critics gave them, or how many awards they received from rigged award shows, or how much money it raked in at the box office. These are the films that I personally find amazing pieces of art that should be recognized for the masterpieces that they are. And without further ado, my number 1 favorite film of my lifetime is 12 Monkeys. This would come as no surprise to those who know me personally, as I have been ranting and raving about this film ever since it first came out in January of 1996, and I've been proclaiming it my favorite film for just as long. When it first came out in the theaters, I saw it with my mother, and I was so blown away. I saw it again with my brothers, and then again with my girlfriend, and then again with a friend, and then again with another friend, and then finally by myself when I was bored. So this remains the movie I saw from start to finish in the theaters the most. I saw it 6 times, and then of course when it came out on video I watched it repeatedly, relentlessly. It's funny, I just made a Star Wars video the other day where I talked about how nostalgia plays a big part in why Star Wars trilogy is looked upon as a masterpiece, and yet I have to be honest and say nostalgia may play a big factor in why I think 12 Monkeys is my favorite film of all time, because I remember this being one of the biggest life-changing moments for me, going to see a big Hollywood movie and being treated to something so original and new. I hadn't seen the likes of it before, and it touched me more than any movie ever had before. In present times, the indie or art house film has been embraced and integrated into mainstream culture, as many films that start out as indie films turn into major hits that everyone talks about, like Juno and films of Wes Anderson. In fact, there are many famous directors that start out in the art house film, but then become mainstream directors who then mix the genres of art house and Hollywood blockbusters, such as Christopher Nolan, Rian Johnson, and Darren Aronofsky. In fact, in present times, the line between what an indie film and a major Hollywood film is often so blurred one can never really be sure, mainly because Hollywood studios caught on to how profitable art house films can be, where many have sub-studios that specialize in indie films. However, it wasn't always this way. In the 80s, there was a very clean line between art house films and the Hollywood blockbuster. On one side, you had films like Out of Africa, Children of the Lesser God in Paris, Texas, and on the other side, you had films like E.T., Rambo, and Ghostbusters, and Never Shall the Twain Meet. The typical art house film was seen as a stuffy, dialogue-driven dramas that held not a hint of action or suspense. However, in the mid-90s, this line began to blur with the success of Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, which was by all accounts an indie film, but as violent can be. And in the late 1995, just several months before 12 Monkeys was released, was another Hollywood blockbuster that raked in the cash but broke all traditional Hollywood conventions, starring Brad Pitt, and that movie was called Seven, which, by the way, you'll find on my list at number 16. That movie had an ending that defied all conventional Hollywood doctrine and apparently was a warm-up for 12 Monkeys. It was marketed as a typical Hollywood film starring Bruce Willis and Brad Pitt, but it turned out to be something completely and utterly different. To me, it was like nothing I had ever seen before, and I had my fill of sci-fi blockbuster movies such as Terminator, Total Recall, and I was expecting a Bruce Willis film like Die Hard or The Last Boy Scout. Instead, what I got was something more complex, thought-provoking, and emotional than anything I had ever expected. Director Terry Gilliam described the film as a European art house film disguised as a Hollywood film. Gilliam is a major reason why this film got made, as he saw the script circulating around Hollywood and was intrigued that something so original and artistic would be associated with Hollywood, so then he did his best to make sure it got made. Interestingly enough, he ended up working with Universal Studios, the studios in which he had a huge feud with before over the release of his film Brazil in 1985. The studio thought the film was too weird and too long, that mainstream audiences would never connect to it, so they forced him to cut out a lot of major scenes. Gilliam went behind the studio's back and screened his version of the film at several film festivals. After receiving high praise from critics, Universal agreed to release his cut of the film, but were not very happy with him. For 12 Monkeys, Gilliam agreed to work with Universal again under the condition he had ultimate say over the final cut of the film. Universal agreed to these conditions but gave him strict, limited budget that he could not go over on and a strict time frame he had to adhere to. Terry Gilliam instantly cast Madeline Stowe to play Dr. Rayleigh. He stated that no one else was ever considered for the role. However, Gilliam's first choice to play James Cole was Jeff Bridges, but Bruce Willis expressed interest in the role mainly because he wanted to work with Terry Gilliam, and the studio tried to push him. Gilliam recalled agreeing to Bruce Willis after he watched Die Hard, as there was a particular scene in which Bruce Willis's character was reminiscing of lost love of his wife while pulling broken glass out of his feet, where he felt the actor showed a vulnerability that he was looking for. And after meeting with Willis, he found Willis to be genuine in his eagerness to expand his range and try something new. However, Gilliam made a list of facial tics and expressions that Willis typically used in his other films and said he wasn't allowed to use any of them in 12 Monkeys. The studio cast Brad Pitt in the role of Jeffrey Goins when he was a fairly unknown actor. However, shortly after he was cast, Legends of the Fall and Interview with the Vampire were released, which propelled him into starhood, and shortly before 12 Monkeys was released, Seven made him an even bigger star. By the time 12 Monkeys came out, he was almost a bigger pull than Bruce Willis. But overall, it was mainly the pull of Terry Gilliam and Bruce Willis that forced this movie to be made. The three main leads took considerable pay cuts. In fact, it was said that had this film not been a huge success and failed to pay back their budget, Willis would have essentially been paid nothing and would have worked for free. Often when I tell people that 12 Monkeys is my favorite film, they then say, well, I must be a huge Terry Gilliam fan, but the answer is no, I'm not. In fact, overall, I don't really care for his other films. Obviously, I don't think he's a bad director. I think he's an outstanding director. I just typically don't care for his style of films. Then how can it be that I name a film that he directed as my favorite film of all time? Well, Gilliam himself has repeatedly and often said that 12 Monkeys is not a Terry Gilliam film. He often referred to himself as a hired gun. That isn't to say he wasn't invested in the film and was just doing it to make a buck. As I said, he had to fight to get this film made, and he had to fight to make sure it was done right. So he was completely invested in making sure this film turned out to be as great as it could. But he didn't see the film as belonging to him. He felt the film more belonged to the writers of the script, David and Janet Peoples. David Peoples was best known for writing Blade Runner and The Unforgiven. Gillian said he did everything he could to honor their original version and felt that the film more belonged to them. In my movie review of Donnie Darko, which was number 3 on my list, I mentioned how that movie was more of a collaboration that depended on many departments all coming together to make a masterpiece, and not just the director whose other projects were mediocre at best. However, the same could be said for my number 2 film, Cloud Atlas, which was a collaboration of 3 directors to bring to life a well-known novel. Well, this same is true of 12 Monkeys being mostly a collaboration rather than the works of an auteur who liked to have total and complete control of the vision of the film, like Steven Spielberg, Peter Jackson, or James Cameron. Gillian has said often that he actually felt a bit disconnected at times during the shoot from the overall story and was mostly hyper-focused on the particular scene that they were shooting at the time. He relied a lot on producer Charles Roven and his editor Mike Audley to keep an eye on the overall film and how it fit together. Watching the film, I can tell that the film owes a lot of its greatness to Gillian, who obviously went to painstaking steps to make sure every aspect of this particular scene worked perfectly, and it totally shows. However, listening to interviews, it's obvious he didn't completely understand the big picture of the film, but producer Charles Roven did, and he was there to keep the film on track. For example, Gillian talked often about how he wanted the film to be more open-ended as to whether or not James Cole was actually traveling through time or if he was crazy. However, there are too many moments in the script that make it clear that he's actually traveling through time, and had Gillian attempted to make it the way that he wanted to, it just wouldn't have worked. But thankfully, Charles Roven understood this and pushed for the scenes that made it clear that he was indeed traveling through time. For example, there were several scenes at the end of the script that made this clear that Gilliam tried to cut out, but Roven forced him to film it, and they kept it in the film, and the film was ultimately better for it. And Gilliam also said he encouraged each department to work on their own and not be dependent on him, also to work closely with other departments and do what they felt was best for the film overall. And of course, because the film had such a limited budget, in many cases they had to improvise and and show initiative to work out with a limited budget. And I found this tends to make films better, as films with an unlimited budget can become lazy and just throw money at all their problems instead of trying to make the film better by focusing on things like story and performance. At times, I wonder if the film would have been better served had it been directed by someone else other than Gillian, who has a few films like Time Bandits and The Adventures of Baron Munchausen and that I really didn't care for. Gilliam would later go on to direct Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, a movie that was okay, but ultimately I didn't think it was that great either. So when I heard Gilliam is going to be making a new film, I'm not overly excited to see it, such as in 2013 when he did a film called The Zero Theorem, which I still haven't seen and I have no desire to see. So it's not like when Christopher Nolan or David Fincher makes a new film where I go out of my way to see it regardless of how good I think the film looks. So in short, even though 12 Monkeys is my all-time favorite film, I don't consider Terry Gilliam one of my favorite directors, and I did notice many of Gilliam's typical quirks in 12 Monkeys, most notably in the scenes that take place in the future. The wacky set design with Bruce Willis being elevated in a chair that shoots him up 12 feet in the air while a big electronic ball with a bunch of TVs on it is displayed, and with the different scientists in weird ways hovering in front of his face. And then there's the scientists themselves, who act very strangely and finish each other's sentences. There's one scene in particular where Cole wakes up in the future and the scientists are singing to him that producer Charles Roven described as pure Gilliam, and Gilliam said it was straight out of Monty Python. So I often ask myself, was all this weirdness really necessary for the film? And the answer I came up with, no. However, this film is not worse off because of it. These touches don't degrade the quality of the film in any way, but as to the overall question of whether the film would have worked better with a different director, the answer is, well, possibly, but it's not likely. I think most Hollywood directors would have turned it into a typical Hollywood blockbuster starring Bruce Willis, where he kicks ass and saves the day. Most likely they would have changed the ending to make it more Hollywood-like, and it was because of Gilliam was striving so hard to honor the original script, something most mainstream directors would never do, that this film turned out as good as it did. Not only that, you can see Gilliam's touch in other places, such as the gritty feel of the poor environment, and how he makes it look fun, and the spontaneity and quirkiness of the various supporting characters that add to the insanity of the film. In short, I think Gilliam was the perfect director for the sense of blurring the line between reality and insanity. So let him have his electronic ball with 12 TVs that hovers in the air. If that makes him feel better, it's worth it to have a devotion to detail and willingness to honor the script on board. As for Bruce Willis, I don't think for 1 second he shouldn't have been involved in the film, because it was obvious he too was giving it his all. Sure, the film would have had a very different feel if someone like Jeff Bridges was playing the main lead, as with Bruce Willis you do get this action hero side of the character, as he's portrayed as a badass who can really kick people's asses. But overall, I would say this is Bruce Willis's best performance ever. In fact, I read several reviews from critics looking back on Bruce Willis's career as a whole, and 12 Monkeys is always brought up as one of his best performances. Because Bruce Willis is one of those actors who is always typecast to play the exact same character in every movie. With Willis, he always plays a variation of the old gruff detective who's divorced and disgruntled, and a smartass, sarcastic demeanor, and a pessimistic view of the world. Even the few movies where he strays from this character arc a little bit, such as The Sixth Sense, he still has this underlying confidence to him that he's is obviously a trait that belongs to the actual man, Bruce Willis himself. However, in 12 Monkeys, he completely and totally breaks this persona and plays someone with a true vulnerability who is almost childlike in some ways, who often lets himself be pushed around by others rather than always being the one in control. And the fact that Willis pulled this off so well makes it one movie where he actually demonstrates he is a great actor and can do more than just play Bruce Willis. The film overall has a real gritty and rough feel, having taken place and filmed in Philadelphia and Baltimore, two blue-collar working-class cities. And the film mostly highlights most of the poor and decrepit aspects of these cities. The film itself is about a man who travels from a dystopian future where the majority of the human race has been wiped out by a deadly virus, and there's only few survivors left that live underground and dark and dank conditions. And so when James Cole travels to the past, it seems like a paradise to him that humans can exist on this luxurious civilization above ground, can breathe the air without fear of being killed by a deadly virus. So the fact the film takes place in what we could see as poor, crime-ridden, and undesirable places to live is juxtaposed through Cole's vision of these decrepit locales as being a beautiful paradise that everyone takes for granted. The juxtaposition is expanded upon by the music, which is often soft and gentle and beautiful in the situations that are often dark and depressing. The film takes place entirely in winter as well, which adds to the cold and depressing feel of the scenery provided. The theme of Key West is used as a far-off paradise, a goal for James to aspire to achieve, but is mostly a fantasy of a perfect life that always is just out of reach, but is ultimately unachievable. But one of the main reasons why I love this film so much is how it blurs the line between reality and insanity. And I love films that could accomplish this, and none accomplish this better than this film. There was a lot of time travel movies that came out before this, Back to the Future, Terminator, Star Trek 4, and none of them played with the aspect of insanity, as one who claims to be from the future, of course, is going to be thought of as insane. Well, this film takes that a step further by eventually having the time traveler be convinced that he is in fact insane. So the aspect of what is real and what is insanity is played with a lot in this film and blurred and done in a way that, in my opinion, no other film has managed to capture as beautifully. Not just the great performances, but the cinematography and the set design lend themselves to blurring the line between insanity and reality, as many of the Dutch tilts and shots that are fluid and spin around are employed to create a very shaky and askew view of reality. The character of Jeffrey Goins, played wonderfully by Brad Pitt, which earned him his first Oscar nomination, was another great example of how the film played with insanity, as his character was clearly insane and had mental issues, but his rants would often describe bigger themes that the overall story was playing with. Though even through this character was indeed quite crazy, he could see overall notions that others could not. In fact, it's been said how similar his rants in this film are to his rants in Fight Club, as he talks about how humanity's only purpose is to be consumers, and there are great nuggets of truth in there that are relevant to modern day society. One of my favorite lines in the whole film is, "There's no right, there's no wrong, there's only popular opinion," which is a statement that really plays into the overall feel of the story, of how everything is flipped on its head and the notion of whether or not Cole is right or wrong is questioned. Are the scientists he's working for villains, or has they imprison him and spy on him, or are they heroes as they ultimately try to better humanity? Many of these things we perceive as normal reality are put into question, and thus the line between insanity and reality is blurred. Dr. Rayleigh, played by Madeline Stowe, is probably the character that goes through the biggest character journey, as once she accepts the fact that James Cole may indeed be from the future, it destroys her whole calm and clean perception of reality and throws it into chaos. Another one of my favorite lines from the film is where she says, "Psychiatry, it's the latest religion. We decide what's right and wrong. We decide who's crazy or not." In essence, this film really plays with the notion of what we perceive as reality may not actually be reality, and time travel is the perfect method in which to do this. This is also very unique for a time travel film, and it firmly sticks to its method of time travel, as there are many different schools of thought on how time travel may work. The one we're most used to, or at least the one I was most used to when I first saw it, is the typical Back to the Future time frame that's often used a lot in the Star Trek franchise, where if you travel back to the past and do something to change the way events of the future play out, then you alter the timeline and thus change the future so that it is totally different, and thus it needs to be corrected or put back the way it should be. So let's take, for example, the grandfather paradox, which speculates on what would occur if you traveled back in time and killed your own grandfather as a young man. This method suggests that you would alter the future so that you never existed. However, the version of you that killed your grandfather does exist because you are from what is now basically another parallel universe that no longer exists. So you exist, but you can't return to the time frame because it no longer exists, if that makes any sense. Or, there's the multiverse method used in the new Star Trek reboot, which suppose if you travel back in time and kill your own grandfather, you would have created a new parallel universe in which you never existed, but the universe you originally came from still exists, but as a parallel universe. And then there are movies such as Looper that mix up and confuse the methods of time travels and don't really stick to one. I found this happen in Star Trek a lot as well. However, 12 Monkeys used a method of time travel I'd never seen before that supposes that you cannot travel back in time to kill your own grandfather, because whatever you've done in the past is in the past and cannot be altered. So if you attempted to kill your own grandfather, your mission is doomed to failure before you even leave, because your own existence is proof that you failed. Later, the film Time Crimes and the TV show Lost would use this method as well. But this was the first time I had ever seen the method employed, and it was certainly done so brilliant. And I had never seen it used so effectively again, not even in Time Crimes or Lost. That's why it kind of irritates me, as I often hear the synopsis of this film summarized by saying a man travels back in time to stop a deadly virus from being released that kills off the human race. It's amazing how many official sources like critics and other advertising sources say something similar to this, but it's totally wrong, because at no point in time does Bruce Willis's character James Cole think he's going to stop the virus from killing the human race. He states very clearly that the past had already happened and you cannot change it. His goal to locate the virus in its pure form is so that the scientists can travel back and study it in order to find a cure in their time, so that they can reclaim the surface of the earth and no longer have to live underground. At no point in time does James Cole think he can change this. The dilemma comes in when he thinks he's insane and this future doesn't exist. But what is assumed by him and Dr. Rayleigh is that if they are not insane, then the human race is doomed to be wiped out. I also want to talk briefly about the romantic relationship between James Cole and Dr. Rayleigh, which is probably one of the most criticized aspects of the film, as it does seem kind of like the obligated love interest story that every Hollywood film must have, and that it was very sudden. But I totally disagree. It was quite sudden, but I thought it played out very well and was built to perfectly. Some people thought it was ridiculous a psychiatrist would fall in love with her patient, but her whole journey in the film was about how her entire worldview and everything she thought she knew was shattered. And James Cole was her only anchor, the only thing she could count on, and throughout all this chaos. And they were together in this journey together that could mean the end of the world. So it makes perfect sense they would form an emotional connection. Moreover, they didn't overplay the romance and showed them madly in love. In fact, the whole romance did seem a bit awkward and had dark undertones throughout. Even when they kissed at the airport, it was a really awkward kiss rather than the romantic Hollywood version of a grand romantic kiss. So I thought the romance was perfectly believable and added to the emotional impact of the film overall. So now's the time where I get into my spoiler section, so if you haven't seen the film, you may want to stop watching this video now or risk having things spoiled for you. Of course, I totally recommend not watching this until you have seen the film so you can watch it unspoiled. So if you haven't seen 12 Monkeys yet, thanks a lot for watching. But if you have, please continue on to my spoiler section, which begins now. So, 12 Monkeys was inspired by the 1962 French short film La Jetée, which was a black and white film made up entirely of still photographs with a narrator telling the story. It tells the story of a prisoner in the future where the human population has been decimated by nuclear war and the survivors are forced to live underground. He is sent back in time as an experiment, and there he meets a woman and falls in love with her. The short film ends with his death that his younger self witnessed. So you can see the similarities to 12 Monkeys and how deeply that film was inspired by La Jetée. I recently got to see La Jetée a few years ago when I attended film school, and they showed it to us in one of the lectures. I liked it a lot, and I thought it was a cool little short film, but the whole time I was watching it, I was thinking 12 Monkeys is just so much better, because 12 Monkeys has much more depth to it. It gets you more invested with the characters, and it shows, and so that the tragic ending is much more emotionally effective. 12 Monkeys also explores the aspect of what is insanity and what is reality and blurs the line between them, and which La Jetée does not do. I mean, La Jetée was good, but 12 Monkeys just does so much more. So that afternoon, after we watched the film at film school, a group of other students were having a conversation about La Jetée compared to 12 Monkeys, and they were talking about how La Jetée was far superior to 12 Monkeys. I was stunned that they had that opinion, but whatever. Everyone has different tastes. And that would be fine if they left it at that, but instead, every time I mentioned 12 Monkeys was my favorite film, they always jump down my throat and be like, Le Jetée is better, Le Jetée is better, which is fucking annoying. I mean, I suppose it's my karma for always saying, oh, Lost Highway is better whenever anyone mentions that they like Mulholland Drive, but at one point I was so sick of them doing this, I told them Le Jetée was pretentious, to which they jumped on my back even more, saying that was ridiculous because all they had back then was still cameras, and they were, after all, French, so it's a bit unfair of me to call it pretentious because it used stills and had a French narrator. And in retrospect, I realized I misspoke. I shouldn't have said that the film was pretentious. I should have said that they were pretentious to constantly say it was better than 12 Monkeys. I mean, come on, how hipster is that to prefer a black and white European film that has a narrator with a monotone voice speaking in French over a display of still photographs? I felt the word pretentious was invented to describe films like these. But overall, objectively speaking, either argument is ridiculous and petty because it all depends on one's point of view and personal preferences. Both films are masterpieces in their own right, but they appeal to different sensibilities and therefore would appeal to different audiences. As La Jetée is a perfect simple short film that is an accomplishment how it manages to tell an effective and emotional story using black and white photographs and a narrator, whereas 12 Monkeys is an expansive look at our society and how we view insanity and mental illness by blurring the line between what is real and what isn't, while telling a truly magical and emotional story through the Hollywood system, using big stars like Bruce Willis and Brad Pitt, but at the same time breaking every Hollywood convention in the book. Terry Gilliam and the writers David and Janet Peoples have repeatedly said that 12 Monkeys is not a remake or a reimagining of La Jetée. It was simply inspired by La Jetée. In fact, they had to work very hard to have the official credit on the film be inspired by La Jetée, which wasn't a credit that previously existed. The only way to say it previously was based on. However, they felt based on didn't apply, so they actually had to fight the Writers Guild in order to use this credit, which was the first film that ever do so. Terry Gilliam himself said he purposely didn't watch La Jetée until well after 12 Monkeys was finished because he did not want the original to influence him. But after he saw it, he had this to say about the relationship between the two films. La Jetée is like an acorn, very simple, very pure, and just perfect. And we made this tree out of it, this great thing with all these branches and everything. So it's very baroque in comparison. The writers David and Janet Peoples described La Jetée as a diving board and 12 Monkeys as the dive. In other words, they simply started with the idea presented in La Jetée and created something totally different from there. In fact, Gilliam talked about how after 12 Monkeys was released, the creator of La Jetée, Chris Marker, reached out to them and thanked them for having him involved in such a beautiful project, to which they were all humbled by. So ultimately, the argument over which is better, La Jetée or 12 Monkeys, is kind of like the argument of what's better, Coke or Pepsi. It's a useless argument that is dependent entirely on one's own personal preferences, and the films are in fact two entirely different pieces that need not constantly be compared to one another, as it is mostly an exercise in futility. But now I want to talk about some of the recurring motifs in 12 Monkeys, which just is another thing that just makes this film brilliant, as it is densely packed with so much to keep the mind occupied. A great example of this is the lecture Dr. Rayleigh gave in 1996, how everything in her lecture is then later seen in the film somehow, and it can be explained through time travel. The most obvious one being she had this picture of James Cole's cellmate Jose, who was back in World War I. Talking about a plague that would wipe out humanity. And then she spoke of another man who appeared in medieval times near Stonehenge, warning of a plague. And then later we see what is no doubt that very same man as a homeless man in Philadelphia reciting the exact same Bible verse, who then very creepily says to Cole, "You're one of us," that excelled at adding to the creepiness of the film. And then there's the pictures the scientists show to Cole in the future of what he should look for, and we later see those events play out in the past, such as the graffiti Dr. Rayleigh wrote on the wall of the Freedom for Animals Association about, "Is this the source? 5 billion people dead?" This is a great example of time travel logic used in the film, because Cole was told in the future that Jeffrey Goins and the Freedom for Animals Association had something to do with the virus. He became convinced it was, and then traveled back to the past where he told this to Dr. Rayleigh, who then spray painted the message on the wall and left the message behind on the answer machine indicating the Freedom for Animals Association was responsible for the apocalypse. So the scientists picked up these messages and relayed them to Cole, and thus you have a loop of why they came to believe the 12 monkeys were responsible for wiping out the human race when in fact they had nothing to do with it. And let's talk about Jeffrey Goins himself. I know someone once said they were unhappy with the fact that the 12 monkeys, which in fact is the title of the film, turned out to be nothing more than a red herring and had nothing to do with the actual devastation that befell humanity. And I find nothing wrong with this. I think it's perfectly well. In fact, I think it's brilliant because it feeds into the overall theme of the film, which attempts to blur the line between insanity and reality. As Jeffrey was portrayed wonderfully by Brad Pitt throughout the film as someone who was totally insane, and therefore it made logical sense he would be responsible for wiping out the human race, because that's what you think. He's a nutter after all. But it turns out, for how crazy he is, he would never actually go that far, and the man who actually does was more of your average run-of-the-mill everyday working class man who would be seen as a decent upstanding member of society, someone who would be a poster boy for sanity. He's actually the one who's more insane enough to wipe out the entire human race. That was a brilliant twist that overall adds to the sense that we don't really know the difference between sanity and insanity. So finally, let me get to the ending of this film, which is a major factor in why I love this film so much. The ending was something that truly broke all Hollywood conventions, and at this stage had never been done before in a major Hollywood film. As I stated earlier, Bruce Willis's character, James Cole, never felt he had the ability to change the past to make it so the apocalypse never happened. However, this isn't entirely true, because once they did identify David Morse's character as the man responsible for wiping out the human race, he did try to stop him, but of course, in keeping with the time travel logic of the film, that attempt was doomed to failure and instead played out exactly the way he remembered playing it out throughout his life, as his younger self was actually there to witness his own death as an adult. This is an intriguing notion first introduced in Jetée that the film plays at beautifully by having the repeated motif throughout the film of this dream, which is actually a memory of James Cole witnessing his own death. Each piece of the dream is shown jumbled through the lens of long-term memory, and so you only get bits and pieces of it throughout the film. In fact, when James Cole tells Dr. Rayleigh about the dream and that she's in it, she tells him that she wasn't always in the dream, she's just been interpreted into the dream recently because of current events. And ironically, she turned out to be wrong in that regard because she was actually there, but the dream was altered to include Jeffrey Goins in it because of the current events in which Cole thought that Goins was involved in the release of the virus. A typical Hollywood film would have been Bruce Willis survives and be the hero and defy all time travel logic and save the human race from destruction. However, this film had the balls to spit in the face of convention and be like, this film, the whole time we've been telling you that the past can't be changed and the human race is doomed to be wiped out. Well, we were right the whole time, because that's exactly what happened. I heard someone once complain about the ending because they felt it was too predictable. predictable, but that was actually the beauty in it. That the ending played out exactly the way the film was telling you repeatedly throughout the film that it would turn out. And it stuck to this logic and just totally tragic ending where the main protagonist is killed, his love interest is doomed to die in the virus outbreak, and the entire human race will be wiped out. It was such a dark and depressing ending that most movies don't have the balls to do this, and the way it played out was just so beautiful and tragic. Although they did give us a glimmer of hope by showing the scientists contact David Morse's character, telling the audience the human race will reclaim the surface of the earth, meaning Bruce Willis's sacrifice wasn't all for nothing and his life did have some meaning. James Cole's death scene was really one of the most beautiful and well-made scenes ever put to screen, in my opinion. The sound design, the cinematography, music, acting, everything just comes together beautifully to create a wonderful work of art that is, in my opinion, something that has never even been close to being topped again. I'll never forget seeing this in the theater for the first time, being completely stuck in my chair, unable to move, being so struck by this overly tragic ending, and then the Louis Armstrong song "What a Wonderful World" comes on. It was just such an amazing choice for the end credits, as it just demonstrates the whole juxtaposition of showing something beautiful with something depressing. In fact, this was done throughout the film using cheerful, relaxing music over dark and dismal imagery. I'm a huge fan of this juxtaposition, and I felt it was pulled off amazingly well here. Everything about this film just worked and came together to create such a beautiful, complex, thought-provoking, and entertaining piece of art that is completely unique and, in my humble little opinion, the epitome of great filmmaking, making this my #1 favorite movie of my lifetime. So that's it for my top 50 favorite movies series. If you haven't checked out the other videos in my series, I would encourage you to do so. And check out my channel for many other videos on films and shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, and Lost. And make sure you subscribe to keep up with the future videos I'll be doing. And thanks a lot for watching.